You're listening to Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Today we're talking about the hazards of ultra-processed food produced for commercial use, often very shelf-stable, ubiquitous in our diets, and not good for us. My guest is Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, who's a practicing physician and broadcaster, also associate professor at University College London. His book is called Ultra-Processed People, the Science Behind the Food That Isn't Food. So, Chris, in advance to trying to give up all the ultra-processed foods in your diet, you spent a few weeks eating almost nothing but UPFs. What did you notice about the effect those foods had on your appetite, your moods, your energy?
Well, I did this experiment because I'm part of a research group and we wanted to get pilot data for a much bigger study that we're now funding. So we did it really properly. And I guess three things mainly happened. I gained so much weight that I would have doubled my body weight in a year if I'd kept eating the 80% ultra-processed food diet that I was eating. We measured my hormone response to a meal and found that by the end of the diet, my hunger hormones remained sky high at the end of a standardized meal. So this is food that we have lots of evidence is being engineered to interfere with our body's systems that say you're full, stop eating. And most of your listeners, most people listening will recognize that there are certain foods that they know they don't want to eat. They're not even enjoying the foods, and yet the food finds itself transported as if by some third-party action into your mouth, and you swallow it. And you're, I want to stop eating, and yet I'm compelled to continue eating. And that's very deliberate in the design. And then we found on brain scanning, we did some very, very detailed MRI scans, that the addiction parts of my brain became much more connected to the automatic habit forming parts of my brain. Now, I was 42 when I did this experiment. We have absolutely no idea what a developing child's brain, eating a diet of 60, 70, 80% ultra-processed food for the first decade of life, we have no idea what it does to their brain. But all the indications are that we should be really concerned. But you said that the experiment was almost a precursor to me stopping eating it. In fact, I hadn't ever had the intention that I would stop eating this food. I started this work as a skeptic to some extent. I wasn't very persuaded by the evidence. And it was while I was studying all the published literature and doing this work, I was speaking to experts all around the world. And one of them in Brazil said this really crucial thing to me. In fact, we weren't talking about my book. We were trying to set up a research protocol. And she kept saying, she's called Fernanda Rapa, she kept saying, it's not food, Chris. It's an industrially produced edible substance. And it was like a tick. It was quite irritating, actually. And by the end of the call with Fernanda, I settled in to eat a dinner of takeaway fried chicken, my favorite thing in the whole world, and I couldn't eat it. It had become disgusting. And my invitation to the reader of my book is really to say, please do keep eating this food. I don't want you to feel judged. I don't want you to feel that you have to resist it. We live in a world where this stuff is so ubiquitous. It is impossible to avoid. It is extremely addictive. So just eat while you read. A lot of people are finding that by the end of the book, they no longer want the food. They can no longer eat the food without being disgusted. So there is this, for the sort of selfish reader who wants something in it for themselves, not just to learn about the food system, I hope by the end of the book, their relationship, if they have an addicted one with the food, will change quite a bit.
Many UPF producers try and add some vitamins and minerals to give us some nutritional justification for consuming those products. But it turns out the benefits of vitamins and minerals really don't translate to supplementation in any form unless we have some kind of clinical deficiency. I feel like this is something a lot of people don't know.
I'm so pleased you said this. I mean, we have a huge amount of scientific data on this, and there has never been any good independent study, i.e. one that wasn't funded by a vitamin company, that has ever shown any benefit whatsoever in a healthy individual from taking any supplement. And the reason for that is probably quite straightforward. Real food does have health benefits, so we can show that eating oily fish is really good for you. Eating fish oil, not so good for you. Eating things rich in magnesium, zinc, vitamin C, whole foods, all have health benefits that we've shown very robustly. Walnuts, the Mediterranean diet, real food has health benefits. We've never been able to extract things from real food. And that's probably because real food is a very complex matrix of not just a few dozen molecules like we can back add to our ultra-processed food, but of tens of thousands of molecules which are bound up intricately and which your body has evolved to dismantle. And in the book, I talk about these experiments on cows and goats, where it's very possible for a cow to have a mixed mineral feed that's very high in, for example, zinc and calcium and iron, and yet they will get an overdose of one of the minerals and become deficient in another, because in the gut, when you take them in supplement form, the gut can't decide which one to absorb, and so rejects one and absorbs another one at an excess dose. And this is almost certainly what's happening in people too, that if you start eating individual molecules out of context, all the health benefits disappear. The other thing is we probably overdose in a lot of these supplements. Almost all of us fall prey to this sort of psychological trap of going, well, if a little bit of vitamin C is good for me, then loads must be even better. And clearly that isn't true with any other bioactive molecule. You know, you don't take 10 times more drug to get a benefit from it if you're taking a painkiller. So the same is almost certainly true of vitamins and minerals.
So it's not universally true, but one reason a lot of these ultra-processed foods taste so good is that they happen to contain a lot of sugar and salt and fat. How do we know that it's the ultra-processing and not the nutritional content of these non-foods that is harmful to us?
Well, the fact that they're high in fat and salt and sugar is probably part of the harm. But one of the really interesting things about when this definition was developed, initially, the scientists who came up with this, their problem was to say, well, look, maybe this food is just simply very high in fat and salt and sugar. Or maybe this is food eaten by people without high incomes, or by people who smoke a lot, or by people who drink a lot. And those things are true. This is food that's very, very cheap. It's very available. And it's particularly low-income communities that are vulnerable to being essentially forced to eat it. So almost all of the epidemiological studies, the big population studies, have made statistical adjustments for fat, salt, sugar, fiber, dietary pattern, and the effect remains exactly the same. In other words, it's the ultra-processing of high-fat, salt, sugar food that makes it dangerous. The corollary of that is to say, if you make a lasagna at home and you layer it with mozzarella and fatty beef and sheets of pasta and great parmesan all over the top of it, that is basically real food. And whilst there is probably a limit to how much of it you should be eating, especially if you're my age and if you're a really brilliant lasagna cook, you could gain weight eating it. Basically that food, you'll know when to stop eating it. It's the store-bought version that has been designed in a laboratory to extract money from you. The purpose is profit, that will interact with your physiology very differently. So eating, butter, milk, meat, fat, carbohydrates, pasta, rice at home in a home-cooked setting, we think is probably extremely good for you. And that is what humans have always eaten. In the one really good clinical study we've got conducted at your National Institutes of Health by a scientist called Kevin Hall, volunteers were randomized to an unprocessed diet or to an ultra-processed diet, and both diets were matched for salt, sugar, fat, and fiber, and they were rated equally delicious by all the participants. The people with unlimited access to the equally delicious unprocessed diet all lost weight, and those on the ultra-processed diet ate 500 calories more per day. So it's the things we think are the main ways the UPF is affecting us is it's incredibly soft. It's all been pulverized and extruded. Think of your chips or your burger or your fried chicken, your pizzas, your cakes, your donuts. There's texture there. There's sometimes crunch, but it's all really, really soft. And so you eat it quickly. And it's very energy dense because it's dry, because dryness leads to shelf life prolongation. So it's eating very dense food quickly. Essentially, you consume calories before your body is able to say, whoa, I've had enough. Then there are the effects of the marketing. We know marketing makes you eat more. And then there are these other effects that we barely understand. The emulsifiers, lots of evidence that they drive weight gain, they damage the microbiome. The flavor enhancers make you eat more. The artificial sweeteners affect your microbiome in lots of different ways. They affect your metabolism. And many of the other additives also increase palatability. You did say one thing, Chris. You talked about the food being what makes it so tasty. And actually what a lot of people find is if you start inspecting this food, if you go to the gas station and buy some UPF and you try and become a connoisseur and you really smell it and you treat it like fine wine or, a very expensive piece of aged steak and you really try and inspect it, this is not food that stands up to scrutiny. It will very quickly become disgusting.
So food chemists have been hard at work for decades now, coming up with replacements and chemicals and substances to kind of trick us into thinking we're eating real food. I had to look this up online because I thought surely I had in my mind the kilograms to pounds conversion wrong. We eat 8 kilograms a year of these synthetic molecules. That is 17 pounds.
Yeah, I mean, we eat more bags of white powder in the form of food additives than any of us use flour for home baking. And that cannot be right. Now, in the UK, and I hate to say this, but in the UK and Europe, we have some regulation of our food additives. I assumed the same was true in the States because your additives are regulated by the Food and Drug Administration, and that is the leading agency globally for regulating pharmaceuticals. In fact, activists and lawyers and environmentalists all were very clear that there is no functional additive regulation in the States. And I basically didn't believe them, so I called the founder of the Food Law Policy Center at Harvard, Emily Broadleaf. She's a professor there, and she said, no, that is true. There is no functional regulation of additives in the States. So no one in the US knows for certain how many different molecules are in your food. We're pretty sure it's more than 5,000. It might be more than 10,000. It might be 15,000. The FDA don't have a list. And if a company wants to add a novel molecule to food in the States, they don't even have to tell the FDA they're doing it. They can decide for themselves if they think it is generally regarded as safe, and they can add it to your food.
So as long as it's not like arsenic that will cause us to drop dead immediately, it's fair game.
Arsenic we know is dangerous. That is pre-regulated because the Food Acts were brought in the 50s to regulate all this. But if a company found a molecule now that for whatever reason they wanted to add because it was a texture improver or a good flavor, no, it might well be very toxic and they would still not have to declare that. So there are very good examples of this where flavors are regulated slightly differently. They're not even regulated by the FDA, they're regulated by the Manufacturing Association. And there are some flavors that are really concerning in terms of their carcinogenic effects, but the industry gets to mark their own homework. There's no external oversight. So no, if there was a molecule like arsenic that was very poisonous, but that really made food taste good, it would not only be possible for a company to add it, it would be almost impossible for them to be detected, because there is no scrutiny of this. I know what I'm saying, even as I say these words, I'm like, this sounds a little bit hysterical. I am really concerned about the regulation of additives in the States. It is the light touch is beyond small government. It is non-existent regulation. So yes, I put it this way. So I go to the States a lot. My younger brother is now an American citizen. He lives in New York. My nieces and nephews are American. I love America. I love going there. I would now not eat a pack of chips in the States. And I feel sort of ashamed saying that to your audience, but I'm really worried about the toxicity of American food.
My guest is Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, practicing physician and associate professor at University College London. His book is Ultra Processed People, the science behind the food that isn't food. You're listening to Think. I'm Chris Boyd. Chris, what do we know about how all those synthetic molecules, all those additives, affect the balance of microorganisms in our guts?
Most of what we know from rodent and other animal studies. And there are probably three main categories that are worrying. There's the emulsifiers, like polysorbate 80 you'll see on lots of things, or carboxymethyl cellulose, the lecithins, the datim, the mono and diglycerides of fatty acids. Now, emulsifiers are like detergents. They mix fat and water together, is what soap does. And They're really useful in cooking because they create a lovely, smooth, creamy feel in your mouth. So milk is an emulsion. Mustard acts as an emulsifier. Egg yolk does in a salad dressing. But these synthetic emulsifiers seem to act as detergents in our gut. They scrub out the mucus. And the way our gut works is a tube going from our mouth to our buds, and it's lined with a sticky, snotty mucus in which trillions of bugs live. And those bugs protect us from harmful bugs. They digest our food and produce very useful molecules that our brains and our hearts need, called short-chain fatty acids. And so when we scrub them out of the gut, that causes a lot of inflammation. And we're seeing worldwide a pandemic of inflammatory bowel disease. Many people listening will have not just indigestion, but will have really bad stomach pain, Crohn's disease, colitis, ulcerative colitis. And we think that the emulsifiers may be linked to that. Then there's the modified starches, maltodextrins, and you'll read this, modified cornstarch or maize starch. They also feed bugs that shouldn't be there. And then there's the artificial sweeteners, which also have dramatic effects. We have been absolutely derelict in failing to collect any data on this. So, the medical community, it doesn't have the resources to do it, and the regulatory agencies don't have the power. So even in Europe and the UK, we simply never ask the question about food additives. How does it affect the microbiome? And some of that is because we don't know much about the microbiome. All we know is that it's important. But when we do tests in rats and mice, we give them emulsifiers at the doses we're all eating every single day. Within a year, those rats develop obesity, inflammation, metabolic disease, overeating disorders, binge eating disorders, anxiety. So there is every reason to think that we should be cautious about these ingredients. And almost more than anything else, it's the synthetic emulsifiers that I try and avoid giving my kids. I mean, I've got to say, my kids eat a lot of junk because I want them to have normal childhoods, and I'm trying to live in a world where I'm balancing genuine rising anxiety about all this with a desire to be sort of normal and allow my kids to go to a friend's birthday party and not feel isolated. I'm hopeful that the environment they live in will change, but I have remarkably little control, even as an expert, over what my kids eat.
My guest is Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, a practicing physician, broadcaster, and associate professor at University College London. His book is Ultra Processed People, The Science Behind the Food That Isn't Food. We'll be right back.